Hi guys. Like we ended off the last video, let's keep talking about the liver. We said on the last video towards the end there that the liver, the blood supply to the liver was quite unique in the fact that they have two different systems providing blood. The first one is blood that comes from the hepatic portal vein. Now this is going to be blood that's coming from the digestive system, okay? And the second system of blood supply is from the hepatic artery. Now this is going to be blood that comes from a branch of the aorta. Alright, let's look at the hepatic portal vein first. 75% of the blood that goes to the liver is going to be deoxygenated blood that's coming from the digestive system. Okay, so the blood's already traveled from the lungs to the heart to the digestive system. It's brought all kinds of oxygen, fresh cells and stuff to the digestive system, and there it's given off its oxygen, it's collected CO2, it's collected all the nutrients that came from the digestive system, and then once it leaves from the digestive tract, the intestines, the stomach, the pancreas, the gallbladder, the intestines, the small and large intestines, all of that blood will flow into the liver. In the liver, that's where we're going to get all those metabolic processes happening. We're going to get stuff being stored, we're going to get stuff being secreted, and all of that stuff is going to be cleansed or passed through the liver before the blood travels anywhere else in the body. So that's where 75% of the blood gets into the liver. The other 25% of that blood flow is going to come from a branch called the hepatic artery that's going to come off of the aorta, which you guys know is the biggest blood vessel, biggest artery in the body, right? That's coming directly from the heart. So the blood supply to the liver needs to be fairly heavy, because it's going to need to have a lot of oxygen there in order to carry out the metabolic processes that are going to happen in the liver. Okay, one more structure to talk about in the liver, and this time the last one will be the gallbladder. Now we mentioned the gallbladder before, but we didn't get any detail. Now what the gallbladder is it's a small pear-shaped organ, and what its main function is to store the bile that's produced by the liver before it gets excreted into the small intestine. Now it stores the bile, it concentrates it, and in some cases it can modify it, and that's the function. So you can see the gallbladder here is this green structure. It's tucked up underneath the liver, close to the small intestine, under the liver's right lobe. So here's a look at our liver up here, and then we get our common, our hepatic, left and right hepatic ducts. We get our common hepatic duct. The cystic duct is what leads into the gallbladder, so the bile will be brought into the gallbladder and stored when we don't need it. In the gallbladder, we can have modifications of the bile. We can change a little bit depending on what physiological process is needed, and then that can get, once we need it, the bile can be excreted through the common bile duct and into the small intestine. Now the liver can produce about 1 liter of bile a day. So some of it will be stored in the gallbladder, some of it will go directly into the small intestine to help us with digestion. Alright, the next part of the digestive system that we need to talk about is the large intestine. Alright, so as always, let's start off talking about the large intestine, talking about the anatomy. And we get to the end of the small intestine, we pass through the jejunum, through the ileum, and we get through another valve. Sometimes it's called a valve, but it's a sphincter muscle, another smooth sphincter muscle called the ileocecal valve. Now this valve is going to protect, it's going to allow food to pass from the small intestine into a section of the large intestine called the cecum, which is the beginning or the start of the large intestine. So the large intestine is going to be divided into 4 parts. The first one we already talked about is the cecum, and that's the beginning part of the large intestine that we can see right here. From the cecum, we're going to move into the colon. So here's our cecum, beginning part of the large intestine. The colon is going to be these next 4 sections. We're going to have our ascending colon, So that's going to go from the cecum, it's going to travel up, which ascending. The next section is going to be our transverse colon, which is going to transverse from our right to our left side. From that, we're going to go to our descending colon, which is going to go down. And then we get this final part of our colon, which is kind of S-shaped, which we call the sigmoid colon. Okay, so those are all parts of our colon. Finally, we'll get into the rectum, which is the almost the very final, the last part of the digestive tract, and then the final or the last part is going to be the right at the end, the anus, where we defecate and we get rid of the waste products. Now, along the colon, we're going to have folds, and these folds are going to allow for expansion or elongation. The colon needs to be flexible. It's going to have food. It's going to have. We're transferring. We're in the final stages of producing feces. We're trying our best to absorb nutrients. So the shape of what's inside the colon is going to change as we move along. So it needs to have that flexibility, that ability to expand and elongate, and then go back to normal. And that's what these folds allow it to do. So the ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid colon, those are what we just talked about in the last slide. There is one more part about the large intestine that we probably should just talk about really quickly, and that's at the very beginning. So at the cecum, there's a little tiny structure here called the appendix. It's only about 8 or 9 centimeters long, about the size of one of your fingers, and it's actually quite a finger shape. So here's a look at the appendix right here. This is going to be the end of the small intestine, where it empties out into the cecum, which is this part here of the large intestine. So the appendix for a long time was thought of as something that has no function or no role to play. And for a long time we just called it vestigial, which means a structure that no longer has any function. We don't think that's true today, although there have been years and years of jokes. So if we look at this, for example, here's our appendix, and he's in a group theory or therapy meeting, and he's saying, sometimes I get so angry I could burst. I'm sure some of you guys have had an infection of your appendix called appendicitis, or maybe you know somebody. And when that happens, what can happen is the inflammation and the infection can cause the appendix to swell, and it can break. And if it breaks, it can actually be fatal, so it can kill you. So the joke here is making fun of the appendix, and of course the appendix is talking to a wisdom tooth, a tonsil, and a gallbladder, and these are all things that you can have successfully removed and still have a very healthy, functional life. Now, that's a thing of the past. What we think happens now is that the appendix serves an important role dealing with the bacteria that live in our large intestine, and we'll get more about talk more about the bacteria in a couple of slides. But bacteria are very, very important in our large intestine, and what scientists believe now is that our appendix serves as a very important storage area for bacteria. So if for some reason the bacteria in your large intestines are killed, for example, you're taking antibiotics for an infection, some of these bacteria will be able to live in the appendix, since it's kind of separate from the large intestine. And then once we go back to normal and we're not taking antibiotics anymore, then the bacteria that live in here can move into the large intestine, and they can get back to their normal roles in there. So it acts as a place where we can reboot our normal or a friendly flora, which is what we call the bacteria that live harmlessly in our gut. Alright, so let's get down to the physiology of the large intestine and talk about the functions. The major function of the large intestine is to absorb water. Okay, we need to get as much water out of our food as we can, because we don't want to waste any water that we have. So absorption of water, and then compacting all of that material that passed through the digestive system that we weren't able to use. A lot of the parts of our food we're not going to be able to use. We'll break down as best we can. We'll absorb as much as we can from it, but not all of it is useful to us. So a lot of it's going to pass through. So we want to get as much water out of that, and we want to compact it so that it's as small and compact as possible. And then we're going to move that through the intestine, and we're going to produce feces. Another thing that the large intestine focuses on is absorption of important things that we get from our bacteria. So there are billions of bacterial cells that live in your large intestine. They live there quite happily. They were there within the seconds after being born, and they'll be there after you die. They're an important part of healthy metabolism. And what a lot of these bacteria do is they further break down the food that we can't. Now, when they do that, they're going to secrete waste products, and some of those waste products are waste to the bacteria, but they're going to be good for us. For example, bacteria Escherichia coli, E. coli, live in our gut. They'll help us produce a compound that helps us synthesize vitamin K. So it's pretty important that we harness this potential from the bacteria. So it's going to absorb water, it's going to absorb the important vitamins that are released from bacterial and from bacterial action, bacterial metabolism. And then finally, it's a place where we store feces prior to defecation. Now, if we look at the intestine, the colon is going to have a much larger diameter than the small intestine. So that's where it gets its name, the large intestine. It's not because it's longer, it's because it's bigger in diameter. So it's got a larger diameter and a thinner wall than the small intestine. In the mucosa, so the lining of the inside of the colon, we won't find any villi, we won't find any really major folds, but it does have intestinal glands in there. And those intestinal glands are going to secrete mucus. There's these cells that are called goblet cells, and one of the things they produce is mucus. The mucus is going to act as a lubrication, so that as the feces becomes more and more dry and more compact, it doesn't get rough, and it's still able to pass through the colon without causing any damage to the tissue. So here's a look at the inside of the large intestine. This is going to be the lumen in here. This is the inside. And you can see here we've got our goblet cells deep in the mucosa, and they're going to secrete mucus that will line the walls of the inside lumen of the large intestine, so the feces can pass through without causing any damage. Again, we're going to have our regular tissue layers. We're going to have our muscularis, we're going to have our mucosa, our submucosa, and then we're going to have our mucosa on the inside. Again, if we look at this, this is a transverse section. We'll have our goblet cells. This will be our mucosa. We're going to have our submucosa here. Then we'll have our muscularis, and then our outside, probably serosa is called in this case. Okay, the colon and the large intestine themselves, we don't have any enzymes here. We don't produce any enzymes to help with digestion or anything like that. Instead, what we have are those bacteria that I was talking about. So our friendly flora, billions of cells, hundreds of different species of bacteria will grow happily in our large intestine. And what they're going to do is they're going to further digest our food even more so than we can. When they do that, of course, they'll produce secretions, and we'll use those secretions as best we can to benefit our metabolism. So some of the roles that the bacteria will play will be to decompose carbohydrates. So the dietary fiber that we take in, our small intestine can't deal with all of it, but the bacteria in our guts, in our large intestine, they can. They'll further break down those carbohydrates, and we'll be able to absorb them. Those bacteria will help us synthesize vitamin K. They'll also help us with biotin and vitamin B5. And they'll also help with breaking down any remaining peptides that we have left over from digestion in the small intestine. Now, the final big role about the large intestine is going to be absorption, and we'll get to absorption when we get to the final video for this unit.